When I married Lydia at 57, I never breathed a word about the 4 auto shops I owned across the Houston area. She believed I was the senior shop foreman at Mercer Auto Center on Westheimer, a decent, quiet man who smelled like motor oil, drove a beat-up F-150, and ate a packed lunch at his workbench every afternoon. I kept that secret for reasons I'll explain. And those reasons turned out to be exactly right. Because the morning after our wedding, she set a suitcase full of my clothes outside the bedroom door and told me, in the same calm voice she used to order coffee, that it was time for me to find somewhere else to live. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. My name is Hugh Mercer. I'm 57 years old, and I've been in the auto repair business since I was 22, when I borrowed $11,000 from my father-in-law and opened a single bay shop in a strip mall off I-10. That shop became 2. 2 became 4. By the time Ellen passed 3 years ago, ovarian cancer, 13 months from diagnosis to the end, I had 4 full-service Mercer Auto Centers across Harris County, a commercial building on Shepherd Drive I rented to small businesses, and a house in the Memorial area we'd paid off together years earlier. Ellen never cared about the money. She kept a garden in the backyard, volunteered at our church's food pantry every other Saturday, and brought me a chicken salad sandwich and an iced tea every Friday afternoon without fail. After she was gone, I kept going to work because the alternative was sitting in that house listening to how quiet it had gotten. Lydia walked into the Westheimer shop on a Tuesday morning in March, 2.5 years ago. Her car was making a sound she described as like a dying cat. Turned out to be a wheel bearing. We fixed it in 2 hours. She waited in the lobby reading a magazine, and when I came out to explain the repair, she laughed at the cat comparison and said she'd been putting it off for weeks because she was worried about the cost. I told her what it came to. She winced a little and thanked me like I'd done her a personal favor. I liked that about her. She didn't pretend she wasn't watching her budget. I never introduced myself as the owner at the shops. I wear the same gray work shirt as everyone else with Hugh stitched over the left pocket. If customers ask, I say I'm the senior tech. It keeps things honest in a way I prefer. So Lydia left that day knowing my first name and nothing else, and somehow that felt like enough of a beginning. Over the following months, she came back twice for routine work, and we talked a little longer each visit. She was 45, divorced for 3 years, raising her son Zach mostly on her own. She rented an apartment in Katy, stressed about the $100 monthly rent, and was juggling 2 part-time jobs along with the occasional shift at a medical billing office. She was trying, she said, just trying to hold things together. I believed all of it. What I didn't know then was that her ex-husband had paid her a settlement of $192,000 in their divorce, that she received $3,200 a month in alimony, that she'd sold a 4-bedroom house in Sugar Land for $385,000 8 months before she walked into my shop looking worried about a wheel bearing, that she owned a rental duplex in San Antonio generating $600 a month in passive income. The struggling single mother working 2 part-time jobs had been sitting on the better part of $500,000 for years and hadn't needed that rent check once. But I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew she made me feel like a person again instead of a man who was simply waiting to feel something. We dated for 2 years. I took her to dinner, helped her carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs when she'd had a long day, fixed a leaky kitchen faucet at her apartment one Saturday because she said her landlord was slow to respond. Her son Zach was 23 and guarded with me at first, but he came around gradually. He worked at a sporting goods store, talked about maybe going back to school someday, and seemed like a young man genuinely trying to figure himself out. His girlfriend Piper was quiet and sharp, the kind of person who listens more than she talks and notices more than she lets on. I liked her immediately. I never told Lydia what I owned. Ellen had always said that when people know you have money, you stop being a person to them. You become an opportunity. I'd seen enough of that over 35 years of building something to know she was right. So I held it back and watched and told myself I was being careful without quite admitting I was afraid. When Lydia and I talked about the future, she told me she hoped to find somewhere stable, something that felt like a real and permanent home. I said I thought we could build that together. She reached across the table and held my hand and said that was exactly what she wanted. The wedding was at my house, small and honest. My daughter Maya flew in from Denver, a handful of neighbors, a few friends from our years in the neighborhood. Gary Bennett, my attorney of 18 years, attended with his wife. Lydia wore a pale blue dress that caught the afternoon light just right. Zach and Piper sat in the front row together, and Zach was smiling in a way that looked genuine. I had written my own vows, and I meant every word of them. Lydia's vows were beautiful. She said I had given her solid ground when she felt like she was sinking. She said she hadn't known it was possible to feel this safe again. I believed her. That is the thing I need you to understand. I am not a careless man. I have run 4 businesses for 25 years, and I have seen people try to take advantage of me in smaller ways than this and caught every one of them. But I believed Lydia completely in that moment, and I think that is because grief makes you want to believe in things, and wanting to believe makes you willing to overlook what you're actually seeing. The reception was in the backyard. Mrs. Tatum from next door brought her famous peach cobbler. My neighbor Al grilled chicken thighs and bragged about his rub recipe to anyone who would listen. Maya danced with Zach in that slightly awkward way strangers do when they're working to make a good impression for someone else's sake. We stayed up past midnight. Lydia talked about redecorating the living room, said she had ideas for the kitchen tile, wanted to put a proper dining table in the corner that had always been empty. I told her to make it feel like hers too. We went to bed happy. I woke the next morning to the sound of drawers opening and closing. Lydia was already dressed when I came into the kitchen, hair pulled back, no makeup, wearing the expression of someone who has already had the conversations they're about to have, in their head several times. Zach was at the table in a shirt he'd clearly slept in. The look on his face was not unkind. It was the look of a man waiting for something to happen that he cannot stop. "Sit down, Hugh," she said. Something in her voice moved through me the wrong way. "Is everything all right?" "Sit down." I sat. She poured coffee and set it in front of me, in a mug I didn't recognize, not one of the set Ellen and I had bought together, and turned to face me with her hands folded. The woman looking at me was not the woman from the backyard the night before. The warmth was gone, not diminished, gone, like a light switched off in another room. "Zach and I have been talking," she said, "and honestly, this living situation isn't going to work the way we'd hoped. The house is too small for the three of us long term, and I think the most practical thing is for you to find a room closer to your shop while we work through the details." I was certain for a few seconds that I had misunderstood her. What details? "The legal details. Once you're settled somewhere, we can communicate through attorneys and get everything sorted out properly." She said it the way a person describes a scheduling inconvenience. Calm and final and completely empty of feeling. "Lydia," I said carefully, "this is my house." She tilted her head. "We're married now. That changes things." She walked to the hallway and came back with a suitcase, mine already packed with enough for a week, and set it by the front door, not roughly, efficiently. I looked at Zach. He looked at the table. Then he looked up, and what I saw on his face was not contempt or triumph. It was something closer to shame. He looked like a person who had agreed to be part of something and was only now, in the specific reality of the moment, understanding what he'd agreed to. "Zach," I said. "I'm sorry, Hugh," he said, and I believed that too. I picked up the suitcase. I walked out the front door of my own house. The house Ellen and I had paid off together in 2019. The house held in the name of Hugh Mercer Properties, LLC, a detail that would matter enormously in the coming days, and I stood on my own front porch in the morning light and tried to make sense of what had just happened to me. Mrs. Tatum was watering her plants next door. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at my face. She didn't ask me a single question. She just said, "Come inside, Hugh," and held the door open. I stayed in her guest room and spent that afternoon with my laptop doing what I should have done 2 years earlier. I started looking. The basics on Lydia Crane were accurate. Divorced in Fort Bend County 3 years prior, one adult son. But the picture beneath the surface was entirely different from what she'd painted. The divorce settlement, $192,000, paid in full. Alimony, $3,200 monthly, documented in public court records. Property sale, a 4-bedroom house in Sugar Land, $385,000, 7 months before she walked into my shop. Rental income, a duplex in San Antonio, her name on the deed, me $600 a month. A Fidelity brokerage account I couldn't access directly but could confirm existed through the original divorce asset disclosures, which were public record. She hadn't been holding things together. She'd been sitting on close to $600,000 while telling me she was nervous about $1,100 a month in rent. The knock came at 7 that evening. It was Piper. She stood on Mrs. Tatum's porch with her arms folded and her eyes red from what I could tell had been recent crying. She said she was sorry to bother me. She said she didn't know if she was doing the right thing. She said she couldn't just let it go. She sat at Mrs. Tatum's kitchen table and told me everything she knew. Lydia had been seeing a man named Donovan for about 7 months. He'd appeared through a dating app while Lydia and I were still together, while she was already talking to me about marriage. He presented himself as a luxury car importer operating out of New Orleans, doing deals across the Gulf Coast region, polished, well-dressed, the kind of man who talks about exclusive investment opportunities in the careful tone of someone doing you a favor by mentioning it at all. He had told Lydia he could generate significant returns on a private fund. Very discreet, very limited. Lydia had been wiring money to an account Donovan controlled. Piper had seen a bank transfer confirmation left open on Lydia's laptop 3 weeks earlier when she'd come over to help Zach with something. The number on the screen was $220,000. I sat very still and let that settle. Zach had known about Donovan for about 3 months, Piper told me. He hadn't known about the money until recently, and when he found out, it had shaken him in a way he hadn't fully worked through. He hadn't told me because the plan was already in motion, and he hadn't figured out how to be the person who stopped it. What was the plan exactly? I asked. The plan was to establish herself in my house, file for divorce within a few months citing irreconcilable differences, and claim a portion of what she believed were marital assets under Texas community property law. She'd done a version of this once before years ago with a man who had simply paid to make her go away. She was counting on me to do the same. What she didn't know, what only Gary Bennett and I knew, was that the house didn't belong to Hugh Mercer. It belonged to Hugh Mercer Properties, LLC, which had held the title since 2018 as part of an estate protection restructure Gary had recommended when I was expanding into my third shop location. Property held in an LLC is not automatically subject to community property claims in Texas, particularly when the marriage postdates the asset structure by years. And every one of the 4 Mercer Auto Centers was registered under Mercer Automotive Group, Inc., incorporated in 2009. Premarital. Separate property. Protected under Texas Family Code. She also hadn't paid attention to the documents she'd signed at Gary's office 2 weeks before the wedding. She'd believed they were insurance beneficiary forms and paperwork to add her name to my truck registration. Gary had explained everything: the prenuptial agreement, the asset protection clauses, the acknowledgement that my premarital business holdings would remain separate property. He'd read the summary clause aloud. Lydia had nodded and signed in 4 places while responding to a text message. Gary had flagged it to me that same day and said he wasn't entirely certain she'd absorbed the content. I told him that was on her. He disclosed everything the law required. I called Gary at 8 o'clock. He answered on the second ring and said he'd been wondering when I'd call. We met the next morning. By mid-morning, I had a complete picture. The prenuptial agreement was valid and properly witnessed. The LLC held the house title. Lydia had no claim to it regardless of the marriage. The shops were premarital separate property. Her only viable marital claim was to a joint savings account we'd opened together with a balance of roughly $4,000 and the F-150 I'd added her to. That was the entirety of what she could argue she was owed. Gary also told me that given the evidence of premeditated fraudulent intent, entering a marriage with a documented plan to dissolve it for financial gain, we had grounds to file for divorce on the basis of fraud. Texas allows it, and it moves faster than you might expect. I drove back to my house Monday afternoon and knocked on my own front door. Lydia opened it wearing one of my old University of Houston sweatshirts. She looked surprised, then composed. "Hugh, I think we should communicate through attorneys from here on." "I'd like a few minutes," I said. She stepped aside. Zach was on the couch. He looked at me and then away in the way people do when they're ashamed, but haven't yet decided what to do with it. I sat in my own armchair and set a folder on the coffee table. "I want to talk about the house," I said. Lydia crossed her arms. "The house is a marital asset, and any discussion of—" "The house belongs to Hugh Mercer Properties, LLC, I said. "Formed in 2017, title transferred in 2018. I can show you the deed." She went completely still. I laid the deed on the table, then the LLC formation documents, then the property tax statement with the registered owner's name. Then, because I had decided if I was going to do this, I was going to do it fully, the business registration for Mercer Automotive Group, Inc., along with a single-page quarterly revenue summary for all 4 shops. Lydia sat down on the couch. The color left her face in stages. "You're not a mechanic," she said. "I'm the owner. I work as a mechanic because that's what I've done since I was 22, and I have no intention of stopping because I have money." Zach picked up the LLC deed. He read it twice, set it down carefully, and looked at the revenue summary for a long moment without speaking. "The prenuptial agreement you signed," I said, "protects all of this as separate property. Gary Bennett explained the document in full before you signed it. You acknowledged in writing that you understood the terms." "I thought that was insurance paperwork," she said quietly. Gary read the summary clause aloud. "You were answering a text message." She started to say something and didn't. "Lydia," I said, "I know about Donovan." The name hit her like cold water. She looked at Zach. Zach looked at the front door where Piper had come in and was standing quietly near the entryway. He looked older than 23 in that moment, more worn. $220,000, I said, "wired to an account he controls over the past 7 months." "That's an investment," she said, but her voice had gone uncertain. "He's generating returns. It's a private fund after the divorce we were going to." "His legal name is Donovan Earl Pruitt," I said, and I slid a printed sheet across the table. 2 fraud convictions in Louisiana. An active warrant in Mississippi for wire fraud. He finds women on dating apps, presents as a successful operator, moves their money into accounts they can't access, and disappears. He's done it at least 6 times that investigators have documented. The room was absolutely quiet. "The money is gone," I said, not to wound her, simply because she needed to know the truth of where she actually stood. "I'm sorry, Lydia, I mean that." She started crying. Not the gentle, controlled kind, the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and sounds like something structural giving way. Zach stood up and walked out the back door. I could hear him on the porch, not doing anything in particular, just needing to be somewhere that wasn't this room for a few minutes. I filed for divorce the next morning on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation and premeditated intent to defraud. Gary moved efficiently. The prenuptial agreement was clean. The LLC structure meant the house had never been a marital asset. Lydia's attorney, once retained, couldn't find a viable angle to challenge either. The attempt to claim any portion of the auto shops failed in the first pretrial conference. She walked away with exactly what she'd brought in, and $220,000 less of that than she'd had the morning she handed me my suitcase. I reported Donovan to the Harris County DA's office the same week. Piper gave a statement. Zach gave a longer one, thorough, detailed, the kind that takes something out of you to produce. The warrant out of Mississippi created a federal thread that brought in additional investigators. Donovan was picked up in Baton Rouge 6 weeks after I filed. The money Lydia had transferred was scattered across accounts in 4 states. She might recover a fraction of it years from now through civil proceedings. She might not. The divorce finalized in 4 months. One of the cleaner ones Gary had handled at that stage of life, he said. Fraud tends to uncomplicate the paperwork. Zach called me on a Saturday in October, 2 months after it was all done. He said he'd been thinking for a while about whether to reach out and had decided he owed me a real conversation at minimum. We met at a diner on Westheimer, 6 blocks from the main shop. He was on time. He looked better than he had in the weeks before everything collapsed, less hollowed out around the eyes. He said he was sorry. Not the reflexive kind of sorry you offer to clear the air, but the kind that takes something out of you to say. He told me he'd known the plan wasn't right, had told himself it was just his mother looking out for herself, which was a story he'd believed until he saw my face in that doorway with my suitcase and recognized the expression from somewhere else. He'd seen it on his father once, he said. A long time ago. He'd promised himself he'd never be the reason someone looked that way. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I meant that too. I asked about Piper. He smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. They were still together. She'd been the one who told him to call me. A few months later, he picked up part-time hours at the Katie shop, doing intake and customer coordination. He's organized and honest with people, and he doesn't cut corners. Last week, my shop manager out there told me without any prompting from me that Zach was the best counter person they'd had in 2 years. I haven't told Zach that yet. I'll tell him when the moment calls for it. Some mornings I get to the Westheimer shop early enough to open the bay doors myself, before anyone else arrives. I stand in the quiet for a few minutes with a cup of coffee and look at the place. The second compressor we added in 2014. The alignment rack I saved for 2 years to buy. The framed photograph on the wall inside the office door. Ellen in a yellow cardigan standing in the backyard the spring we put in her first rose bushes, squinting into the afternoon light, laughing at something I'd said that I can't remember anymore. She used to bring me that chicken salad sandwich every Friday without fail. I kept telling her to stay in the garden where she was happy and let me handle lunch. She never listened. I'm glad she didn't. I think about all of it sometimes, about how a person can go looking for something they've lost and make themselves vulnerable in ways they don't fully see until the moment that vulnerability gets used against them. About how that isn't foolishness, it's just what grief does. It makes you want to believe in things again, and wanting to believe makes you willing to overlook what you're actually seeing. I still believe in things. I move more carefully now, and I pay closer attention to what's actually in front of me rather than what I'm hoping is there. But I haven't stopped. The roses in the backyard did well this fall. Better than last year. I cleared the beds in September and put down fresh mulch, and they responded the way things do when you give them what they need and leave them alone to grow. Ellen would have an opinion about my pruning technique that would almost certainly be correct. The best thing I can say about all of it is this. When everything fell apart, when I was tested in ways I hadn't anticipated, I found out I was still the person I'd always tried to be. I protected what mattered. I chose not to let anger become the thing that defined what came next. And I ended up with something I hadn't expected. A 23-year-old kid putting in honest work 6 blocks away, calling me on a Saturday because he decided he owed me the truth. That's worth more than anything Lydia thought she was going to take.